They were boys disguised as soldiers, sailing into a midnight tempest that history would immortalize, yet many would never survive to witness the dawn. The heavy steel of the ship groaned against the waves, matching the silent dread echoing in the minds of 50,000 men heading toward a heavily fortified slaughterhouse. Captain Arthur Davies stood on the trembling deck of the transport vessel, wiping the cold, salty spray from his weathered face while staring into the impenetrable darkness of the English Channel that concealed their terrifying destination. The storm raged with unrelenting fury, tossing the massive armada like fragile wooden toys across the churning black waters of the unforgiving sea. Below the iron decks, the suffocating stench of diesel fuel, stale sweat, and acidic vomit filled the cramped compartments where thousands of young infantrymen waited in agonizing suspense. Davies descended the narrow metal stairs, his heavy combat boots clanking against the steel grating, determined to project an aura of absolute confidence that he severely lacked in the quiet solitude of his own anxious mind. He navigated the dimly lit corridors, stepping carefully over the pale, seasick recruits who were desperately clutching their standard-issue rifles, as if those wooden stocks were their only remaining connection to a sane world. "Keep your heads down and your weapons dry, gentlemen," Davies instructed with a low, gravelly voice that briefly cut through the cacophony of groaning metal and violent retching. "We have a crucial appointment on the continent, and the entire free world is eagerly waiting for us to finally punch our ticket," he added firmly. A young private named Miller looked up, his face devoid of color, trembling violently as he clutched a crumpled letter written on damp paper. "Sir, do you honestly think the naval bombardment will wipe out those German bunkers before we even hit the sand?" Miller asked, his voice cracking with desperate hope. Davies placed a steady, reassuring hand on the boy's shivering shoulder, offering a grim smile. "The Navy will certainly do their part, son, but ultimately, it is the infantry that must claim every single bloody inch." Despite his reassuring words, a profound sense of foreboding tightened like a cold iron vice around the veteran captain's fiercely beating heart. He knew the terrifying intelligence reports regarding the formidable Atlantic Wall, an intricate network of reinforced concrete pillboxes, hidden artillery batteries, and deadly interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The sheer logistical magnitude of Operation Overlord was undeniably awe-inspiring. Yet Davies understood that brilliant strategic planning often dissolved into utter, chaotic madness the moment the first hostile bullet snapped fiercely past a frightened soldier's vulnerable head. The relentless rocking of the troop transport vessel showed absolutely no signs of diminishing as the darkest hours of the early morning slowly dragged on. Men attempted to perform final, meticulous checks on their essential combat gear, silently counting their ammunition clips and fastening their heavy webbing with visibly trembling fingers. The agonizing waiting was undeniably the most torturous phase of any military operation, a psychological crucible where vivid imaginations conjured horrific scenarios far worse than the brutal reality that patiently awaited them on the distant French shoreline. Davies paused near a small, flickering red light, carefully reviewing the worn tactical maps illuminated by the dim, eerie glow in the ship's claustrophobic belly. Sector Easy Red of Omaha Beach was their designated objective, a seemingly insignificant stretch of coastal sand that was about to become the epicenter of a monumental global struggle. He traced the topographical lines representing the imposing bluffs overlooking the beach, fully realizing that those elevated positions provided the entrenched enemy with a devastatingly clear, unobstructed view of the incoming American assault waves. Another violent wave crashed heavily against the ship's sturdy hull, momentarily throwing several heavily burdened soldiers off balance and sending a chorus of muffled curses echoing through the room. "Check your life preservers and ensure your gas masks are secured," the platoon sergeant barked loudly over the persistent ambient noise of the laboring engines. Davies nodded approvingly at the sergeant's vigilant discipline, knowing that adherence to basic, repetitive military routines offered these terrified young men a vital, temporary distraction from the looming specter of their potentially imminent demise. As the designated H-hour steadily approached, the suffocating atmosphere within the transport vessel grew increasingly tense, thick with an unspoken, collective realization of their grim reality. A chaplain quietly moved among the tightly packed ranks, offering whispered prayers and final absolutions to men who were fully prepared to sacrifice their futures for a liberated Europe. Davies watched this solemn, heartbreaking ritual with respectful silence, silently uttering his own private plea to whatever higher power might be listening, asking not for personal survival, but for the strength to lead effectively. The sudden, jarring change in the engine's rhythmic vibration signaled that they had finally reached the designated transport area where the perilous transfer process would begin. Loud klaxons suddenly blared their shrill, unforgiving warnings throughout the massive ship, instantly shattering the agonizing anticipation and replacing it with frantic, purposeful military action. "Stand up and hook up," officers shouted urgently, their commanding voices echoing down the steel corridors as thousands of heavily encumbered infantrymen began to shuffle clumsily toward the designated embarkation stations on the rain-swept upper decks. Emerging from the oppressive lower decks into the biting, salt-laden wind of the turbulent English Channel was a brutal shock to their exhausted sensory systems. In the gloom, Davies could faintly distinguish the terrifying silhouettes of countless Allied warships maneuvering into their firing positions, a truly formidable armada poised to unleash unparalleled destruction. Yet, despite the immense, comforting presence of this unprecedented naval firepower, the vast, churning expanse of dark water separating them from the hostile Normandy coast felt impossibly wide, a terrifying abyss they must inevitably cross. The dangerous process of climbing down the slippery, swinging cargo nets into the small, flat-bottomed Higgins boats was a treacherous ordeal complicated by the heavy seas. Men burdened with nearly 80 pounds of equipment struggled desperately to maintain their precarious grip as the wooden landing craft violently rose and fell with the massive swells. Davies coordinated the chaotic descent, shouting crisp instructions over the howling wind, ensuring that every frightened soldier safely reached the tossing boats that would soon serve as their terrifying chariots into the jaws of hell. Once fully loaded, the landing craft circled aimlessly in the rough water, waiting for the precise operational signal to form their designated assault lines and head ashore. Cold ocean spray relentlessly drenched the huddled men, soaking through their uniforms and chilling them to the bone as the nauseating motion of the small boat intensified their misery. "Hold on tight, boys. It is going to be a remarkably bumpy ride to the beach," Davies yelled, gripping the icy steel rim of the boat while staring resolutely toward the dark, unseen horizon. The deafening roar of massive naval guns suddenly erupted behind them, illuminating the turbulent night sky with brilliant, jagged flashes of blinding orange and yellow light. The earth-shattering bombardment had officially commenced, sending tons of high explosives hurtling over their heads toward the deeply entrenched German defensive positions waiting in the distance. As the Higgins boat abruptly turned and began its terrifying final run toward the French coastline, Davies braced himself, acutely aware that the true, unspeakable horror of this historic morning was only just beginning to unfold before them. The rhythmic thumping of the diesel engine became a hypnotic, terrifying drumbeat, driving them relentlessly forward into the violent, unpredictable tempest of modern warfare. Every passing second felt like an agonizing eternity as the small, vulnerable craft violently smashed through the towering, white-capped waves of the dark English Channel. Davies glanced back at his silent, heavily burdened men, knowing with absolute, horrifying certainty that the shores of Omaha Beach would permanently demand a devastatingly high toll in young American blood before the sun finally managed to rise. The deafening naval bombardment suddenly ceased, leaving an ominous, breathless silence hanging over the fog-drenched coastline, a silence that did not signify a shattered enemy, but a perfectly loaded trap waiting to snap shut on the approaching steel coffins. Captain Davies strained his eyes through the thick, swirling mist, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of the supposedly obliterated concrete bunkers. The Higgins boat pitched violently, throwing the tightly packed soldiers against each other in the terrifying quiet that replaced the thunderous artillery barrage. The dense smoke and fog completely obscured the looming bluffs, masking the terrifying reality that the devastating aerial and naval bombardment had largely missed its crucial targets. The massive craters meant to provide essential cover for the advancing infantry were practically non-existent on the flat, exposed expanse of wet sand. "Keep your heads down and prepare to disembark rapidly," Davies shouted, his voice cracking slightly as the realization of their terrible vulnerability washed over him. The enemy was waiting patiently, heavily armed and entirely untouched. The flat-bottomed landing craft surfed aggressively on the incoming tide, its powerful diesel engines straining against the relentless, powerful pull of the turbulent coastal currents. Jagged steel obstacles, known ominously as Rommel's asparagus, began to emerge menacingly from the frothing gray water, explicitly designed to rip the hulls off approaching boats. The skilled coxswain frantically spun the heavy wooden wheel, desperately maneuvering the clumsy vessel through the deadly maze of mined steel beams and submerged wooden stakes. One wrong turn would mean instant, fiery annihilation. As the coastline gradually solidified from a blurry gray smudge into a distinct, terrifying reality, the sickening smell of cordite drifted heavily across the freezing ocean waves. Young Private Miller gripped his rifle so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white, his wide, fearful eyes fixed firmly on the impenetrable wall of smoke ahead. "Do you think they are dead, sir?" Miller whispered, his voice trembling violently over the rhythmic thumping of the boat's engine. Davies did not answer immediately, staring grimly at the silent shoreline. "Expect heavy resistance and trust your training unconditionally," Davies finally responded, projecting a hollow confidence he desperately wished he could genuinely feel in his own racing heart. The terrifying silence from the beach was far more unnerving than the deafening roar of the previous naval guns, creating an unbearable psychological pressure cooker. The men huddled lower behind the thin steel ramp, listening to the relentless crashing of the icy waves and the synchronized, ragged breathing of 30 terrified soldiers facing their seemingly inevitable demise. Suddenly, a terrifying high-pitched whistle sliced through the thick morning fog, followed instantly by a massive, geyser-like explosion of gray water just 50 yards from their port side. The illusion of a shattered enemy defense instantly evaporated as German artillery batteries precisely registered the coordinates of the incoming American landing craft. "Incoming fire! Brace yourselves." The coxswain screamed in absolute panic, wrestling with the controls as another heavy shell violently impacted the ocean surface. The deadly trap had officially snapped shut on the approaching fleet. The sky above them quickly filled with the terrifying, tearing canvas sound of incoming mortar shells, randomly dropping deadly fragmentation into the tightly packed ranks of the vulnerable assault waves. To their immediate right, a neighboring Higgins boat took a direct, catastrophic hit, exploding into a horrific fireball of splintered wood, twisted metal, and agonizing screams. Davies instinctively ducked, shielding his face from the cascading debris and burning oil that rained down mercilessly upon them. There was absolutely nowhere to hide in the open, churning water. Deadly streams of glowing tracer rounds began to crisscross the darkened sky, weaving a beautiful but lethal tapestry of brilliant green and red light directly above their exposed heads. The heavy MG-42 machine guns positioned strategically on the towering bluffs had finally opened fire, their terrifyingly rapid rate of fire sounding like tearing linoleum. Bullets began striking the thick steel ramp of their landing craft with rhythmic, deafening clangs, violently announcing the horrifying reality of the lethal gauntlet they were about to willingly enter. "As soon as that ramp drops, you move fast and you spread out immediately," Davies bellowed with every ounce of command presence he could summon over the deafening chaos. "Do not stop for anything, and head straight for the seawall if you want to live to see tomorrow," he continued, his eyes locking onto the terrified faces of the young men who were relying entirely on his seasoned leadership. The deafening roar of the enemy machine guns completely drowned out their desperate, fearful prayers. The landing craft abruptly ground to a violent, jarring halt, striking a submerged sandbar several hundred yards short of the relatively safe, dry shoreline they desperately needed to reach. The sudden deceleration threw the heavily burdened infantrymen forward, creating a confused, tangled mass of limbs, rifles, and bulky canvas equipment in the cramped space. "We are stuck on a sandbar. I cannot get us any closer to the beach." The frantic coxswain yelled defensively, gesturing helplessly toward the deadly, bullet-swept expanse of churning surf ahead. A brief, agonizing moment of hesitation paralyzed the entire squad as the terrifying reality of their precarious situation became undeniably clear amidst the deafening roar of incoming artillery fire. They were trapped inside a stationary, floating metal box that was rapidly becoming an incredibly easy target for the highly trained German gunners elevated on the bluffs. Davies knew that staying inside the stalled landing craft was an absolute death sentence, and he had to force these terrified young boys directly into the freezing, lethal water. "Drop the ramp! Drop the damn ramp right now!" Davies ordered furiously, unholstering his heavy sidearm and physically pushing his way toward the front of the densely packed boat. The terrified coxswain hesitated for a fraction of a second before desperately slamming his heavy fist against the large mechanical release lever mechanism. The heavy steel door holding back the freezing ocean and the relentless storm of enemy bullets finally began to lower slowly with a loud, agonizing metallic screech that echoed across the water. Cold, gray seawater immediately rushed violently over the descending steel lip, rapidly flooding the deck and soaking the terrified soldiers instantly up to their shivering, heavily booted knees. Through the widening gap, Davies witnessed a horrifying panoramic view of absolute slaughter unfolding on the desolate, smoke-covered expanse of Omaha Beach lying directly ahead. The previously pristine shoreline was already littered with the burning wreckage of destroyed vehicles and the motionless bodies of brave men from the earlier assault waves who had brutally perished. The merciless German machine gunners instantly shifted their concentrated fire toward the newly opened target, pouring thousands of armor-piercing rounds directly into the vulnerable, exposed mouth of the landing craft. The deafening roar of the heavy weapons was utterly overwhelming, completely drowning out the agonizing screams of the first young men who were violently struck down. "Over the sides! Get out of the boat immediately!" Davies roared, grabbing Private Miller by his thick webbing and physically throwing the terrified boy over the protective steel armor. The captain boldly followed his men into the freezing, churning ocean, plunging deeply into the chest-high water while desperately holding his heavy rifle high above his helmeted head. The icy shock of the frigid English Channel forcefully stole the breath from his lungs, momentarily paralyzing his exhausted muscles as deadly bullets angrily hissed through the water around him. The supposedly impenetrable Atlantic wall stood defiantly intact before them, violently unleashing a terrifying storm of lead and steel upon the desperately struggling American infantry. The iron ramp slammed into the shallow water, and in a single, merciless second, the meticulous theories of modern warfare dissolved into the brutal arithmetic of human survival, where every inch of wet sand cost a dozen heartbeats. The supposedly weakened German defenses unleashed an unrelenting torrent of highly concentrated machine gun fire that effortlessly shredded the thick steel of the landing craft. Captain Davies watched helplessly as the first row of heavily laden soldiers was instantly cut down, their lifeless bodies tumbling awkwardly into the violently churning, blood-stained surf of the freezing English Channel. Frigid ocean water quickly filled Davies's heavy leather combat boots as he desperately plunged waist-deep into the unforgiving sea, his ears ringing from the deafening concussions of exploding artillery shells. The sheer weight of his soaked woolen uniform and standard-issue combat gear threatened to drag him beneath the dark, frothing surface permanently. "Keep moving forward! Do not stop in the water!" he roared with every ounce of his remaining strength, grabbing a paralyzed young infantryman by his sturdy canvas suspenders and violently hauling the terrified boy toward the distant, smoke-obscured French shoreline. The relentless barrage from the elevated enemy positions was entirely indiscriminate, transforming the shallow coastal waters into a horrific, inescapable slaughterhouse of screaming men and shattered military equipment. Heavy mortar rounds descended from the gray morning sky with terrifying precision, detonating violently beneath the surface and sending massive geysers of crimson-tinted water high into the air. Men burdened with 80 pounds of essential combat gear simply sank like stones, desperately thrashing against the crushing weight of their own survival tools as the merciless ocean silently claimed those who managed to evade the flying shrapnel. Panic rapidly infected the tightly packed ranks of the surviving infantrymen as they hopelessly attempted to wade through the lethal obstacle course of submerged steel spikes and floating corpses. The deafening tearing canvas sound of the feared MG-42 machine guns echoed continuously across the chaotic beachhead, laying down an impenetrable wall of interlocking crossfire that systematically harvested the incoming American waves. Private Miller, still trembling violently from the initial shock of the devastating ambush, blindly fired his soaked rifle toward the towering, impenetrable bluffs, an utterly futile gesture of terrified defiance against an invisible, deeply entrenched enemy. "Save your ammunition and focus entirely on reaching the seawall," Davies bellowed hoarsely over the overwhelming cacophony of modern industrialized slaughter, forcefully pushing Miller forward through the crimson-stained surf. The sheer scale of the unfolding disaster was absolutely paralyzing. Yet the seasoned captain instinctively knew that succumbing to the overwhelming terror would only guarantee their immediate, collective annihilation on this desolate beach. He methodically navigated the treacherous floating debris field, intensely scanning the hazy, explosive-scarred horizon for any viable path through the meticulously engineered killing zone that stretched endlessly before their desperate, terrified eyes. Surviving the agonizing traverse from the sunken landing craft to the relatively solid ground of the exposed beach felt like an impossible, surreal nightmare stretched across a horrific eternity. The damp, heavy sand offered absolutely no protection from the relentless hail of armor-piercing bullets that angrily kicked up tiny, lethal geysers all around their desperately crawling bodies. Davies threw himself forcefully behind a massive, rusted steel anti-tank obstacle, gasping violently for precious oxygen while frantically attempting to assess the catastrophic damage inflicted upon his rapidly disintegrating, profoundly traumatized combat unit during the brief, catastrophic crossing. Less than half of the men who had anxiously occupied his specific landing craft had successfully reached the narrow, incredibly dangerous strip of sand separating the ocean from the bluffs. The agonizing screams of the severely wounded soldiers desperately calling for their mothers or pleading for immediate medical attention formed a haunting, continuous soundtrack to the unfolding massacre. Medics crawled bravely through the intense, sweeping crossfire, their stark white helmets emblazoned with prominent red crosses, offering absolutely no immunity from the devastatingly accurate snipers positioned strategically within the heavily fortified concrete bunkers overlooking the beach. The situation on the sprawling Omaha beach was rapidly deteriorating into utter, unmitigated chaos as subsequent waves of infantry continued to land directly into the meticulously prepared, deadly crossfire. Disabled tanks and burning transport vehicles littered the narrow, congested shoreline, creating temporary, highly vulnerable metal fortresses behind which terrified soldiers desperately huddled for fleeting moments of illusory safety. Davies knew with absolute certainty that remaining pinned down on the exposed lower beach was a mathematically guaranteed death sentence, as the rising tide would inevitably drown anyone who failed to quickly advance beyond the deadly shingle. "We have to move up to the shingle right now, or we are all going to die right here," Davies shouted urgently to a disoriented lieutenant from another decimated company. The young officer stared back with blank, uncomprehending eyes, completely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the traumatic violence erupting continuously around his shivering, mud-caked body, realizing that conventional military command structures had completely collapsed under the intense pressure. Davies aggressively seized the initiative, determined to physically drag these terrified, immobilized survivors toward the slim, precarious safety of the distant wooden seawall ahead. Gathering a handful of trembling, deeply shocked riflemen, the captain signaled for a desperate, coordinated sprint across the completely exposed, bullet-swept expanse of deadly, open terrain, separating their meager cover from the seawall. "On my mark, you run as fast as you can and you absolutely do not look back," he commanded fiercely, pulling a vital smoke grenade from his heavy web belt and hurling it forcefully toward the most active enemy machine gun nest. The thick, gray chemical smoke blossomed rapidly, providing a brief, fragile visual screen against the relentless, murderous gaze of the well-hidden German defenders. They sprinted wildly across the treacherous, crater-pocked sand, their heavy boots slipping dangerously on the slick, blood-soaked ground as deadly artillery shells detonated with deafening, earth-shattering force entirely too close to their vulnerable, exposed bodies. The air was incredibly thick with flying, razor-sharp shrapnel and the nauseating, metallic smell of fresh blood, creating a truly suffocating atmosphere of pure, concentrated terror that threatened to completely overwhelm their fragile senses. Davies felt the angry hiss of a passing bullet violently graze his left shoulder, but the massive surge of adrenaline completely masked the immediate, stinging pain of the superficial wound. Collapsing heavily against the sturdy, reassuring wooden timbers of the low seawall, the exhausted men violently gasped for air, their chests heaving rhythmically as they temporarily escaped the direct, merciless line of enemy fire. They had miraculously survived the brutal arithmetic of the initial beach assault, crossing the deadly, exposed expanse of wet sand that had indiscriminately claimed the lives of thousands of their brave comrades. However, as Davies slowly looked up at the imposing, heavily fortified bluffs towering menacingly above them, he realized their horrific, bloody nightmare on Omaha Beach had only just truly begun. Pinned against the concrete seawall, with the ocean turning crimson behind them, the shattered remnants of the division realized a chilling truth. The only way out of this carefully engineered hell was to climb directly into the throat of its roaring fires. Captain Davies pressed his mud-caked back against the splintered wood and cold stone, his chest heaving as the relentless cacophony of German machine guns chipped away at their fragile sanctuary. The devastating reality of their grim situation settled heavily upon his exhausted shoulders. They were utterly trapped between the rising tide and an impregnable fortress of death. The deafening roar of artillery shells impacting the blood-soaked sand just yards away violently shook the earth beneath their trembling bodies. "We cannot stay here, sir. They are zeroing in on our position," Private Miller screamed frantically over the terrifying noise, his eyes wide with unadulterated panic as a mortar round obliterated a nearby cluster of wounded men. Davies nodded grimly, wiping a mixture of salt water and blood from his grit-covered face while quickly scanning the towering bluffs directly above them. The meticulously fortified enemy bunkers were systematically slaughtering the trapped American forces with chilling, calculated precision. "If we remain pinned down on this beach, we will all be dead within the hour," Davies declared firmly to the huddled cluster of terrified infantrymen shivering beside him. He forcefully grabbed a heavy Bangalore torpedo from a fallen combat engineer, the long metal tube representing their only viable key to breaching the imposing defensive perimeter. The dense network of deadly concertina wire stretching across the steep, sandy incline stood as a formidable barrier between the slaughtered assault waves and the heavily entrenched German defenders. They had to aggressively blow a path through the lethal, jagged steel obstacles. Crawling cautiously on his stomach through the wet, coarse sand, Davies signaled for two courageous volunteers to follow his desperate lead toward the intimidating wire entanglement. The air immediately above their low helmets violently cracked and hissed with thousands of passing armor-piercing bullets, forcing them to press their vulnerable bodies completely flat against the unforgiving earth. Every agonizing inch gained required an immense, almost superhuman effort of raw will, as the sheer terror of sudden, violent death constantly threatened to paralyze their exhausted, aching muscles. The deafening symphony of destruction raged continuously around their terrifying, suicidal forward crawl. Reaching the intimidating base of the dense barbed wire, Davies hurriedly connected the explosive metal tubes with trembling, mud-slicked hands while furiously barking orders to his terrified companions. "Set the fuses and get your heads down right now," he yelled desperately, forcefully shoving the assembled Bangalore torpedo deep into the tangled, rusted coils of the formidable German obstacle. The men scrambled frantically backward, violently throwing themselves into a shallow artillery crater just moments before a deafening, earth-shattering explosion violently ripped through the heavily fortified defensive perimeter. A massive cloud of dark, suffocating smoke and flying sand instantly erupted. The powerful blast successfully tore a jagged, smoking hole through the impenetrable wire, creating a narrow, dangerous avenue of approach up the steep, heavily defended incline. "Move out! Go! Go! Go!" Davies roared with absolute ferocity, leaping from his shallow crater and charging aggressively into the blinding smoke with his standard-issue rifle raised. Private Miller and the surviving infantrymen blindly followed their seasoned captain, their primal fear temporarily overridden by the massive surge of adrenaline pumping furiously through their exhausted bodies. They were finally taking the desperate fight directly to the heavily entrenched enemy positions above. Scrambling frantically up the treacherous, sandy slope of the imposing bluffs proved to be a nightmarish, physically exhausting ordeal that severely tested the limits of their human endurance. Loose dirt and sharp rocks continuously gave way beneath their heavy combat boots, causing exhausted men to slide backward into the deadly, sweeping arcs of merciless machine gun fire. Davies fiercely grabbed exposed roots and jagged rocks, desperately hauling his heavy, soaking wet body upward while providing covering fire for the struggling soldiers, violently scrambling right behind him. The air grew incredibly thick with the suffocating, acidic stench of burnt cordite. Approaching the first concrete pillbox, the deafening chatter of the devastating MG-42 weapon suddenly stopped as the terrified German gunners frantically attempted to reload their overheated weapon system. Sensing a fleeting, critical opportunity, Davies pulled a heavy fragmentation grenade from his webbing, swiftly pulled the pin, and hurled it accurately through the narrow, smoking firing slit. "Fire in the hole," he screamed urgently, violently tackling Miller to the rough ground just as a muffled, heavy detonation violently shook the thick concrete foundations of the bunker. A thick plume of black smoke slowly billowed from the dark. The brutal destruction of the first machine gun nest provided a crucial, temporary moment of desperately needed relief for the heavily pinned down American forces gathered below. Seizing the vital momentum, small, disjointed bands of courageous infantrymen began to aggressively swarm up the steep, smoking bluffs like angry ants pouring from a disturbed colony. Davies aggressively kicked open the heavy steel door of the destroyed bunker, his rifle perfectly leveled as he stepped cautiously into the dark, incredibly smoky interior filled with the gruesome, shattered remains of the enemy defenders. The brutal reality of close-quarters combat was truly sickening and horrifying. Clearing the extensive, deeply entrenched network of interconnected trenches and fortified pillboxes quickly devolved into a savage, merciless series of violent, bloody, and entirely chaotic close-range infantry skirmishes. Young, terrified soldiers on both opposing sides viciously exchanged point-blank rifle fire, deadly hand grenades, and desperate, thrusting bayonet strikes in the claustrophobic, muddy confines of the defensive works. Captain Davies functioned purely on raw, ingrained military instinct, rapidly discharging his weapon and forcefully barking crucial tactical orders over the deafening, continuous roar of the ongoing battle. There was absolutely no room for hesitation or mercy in this brutal, unforgiving environment. "Watch your flanks and clear those communication trenches immediately," Davies commanded forcefully, quickly reloading his empty rifle while intensely scanning the chaotic, smoke-filled battlefield for any remaining threats. Private Miller, his face now completely covered in dark mud and dried blood, bravely tossed another explosive grenade into a deeply fortified enemy dugout before aggressively rushing forward with his bayonet firmly fixed. The sheer, overwhelming brutality of the intense combat fundamentally transformed these innocent young boys into hardened, lethal killers out of pure, desperate necessity. They were systematically dismantling the supposedly invincible Atlantic Wall through sheer, unparalleled human sacrifice. As they methodically neutralized the final, stubborn pockets of fierce German resistance along the contested cliff edge, the deafening, overwhelming noise of the brutal battle finally began to slowly recede. Exhausted, bleeding, and profoundly traumatized by the horrific violence they had just successfully perpetrated and miraculously survived, the surviving American soldiers collapsed heavily onto the blood-soaked green grass. Davies stood silently at the very edge of the conquered bluff, his chest heaving violently as he lowered his smoking weapon and stared out over the vast, devastating expanse of the ruined beach below. The impossible breach was finally accomplished. They had finally torn a jagged hole in the impenetrable fortress of Europe. Yet as Davies stared down at the devastating crimson tide retreating from the sands, he understood that the true cost of this fragile foothold would not be measured in captured miles, but in lost generations. The relentless, deafening cacophony of heavy artillery and rapid machine gun fire that had violently consumed their morning slowly began to fade into a hollow, haunting silence. A heavy, suffocating smoke drifted lazily across the ruined bluffs, masking the horrific carnage that now blanketed the bloody French coastline below their exhausted boots. The sprawling expanse of Omaha Beach had been fundamentally transformed from a quiet strip of coastal sand into a staggering, apocalyptic graveyard of shattered military equipment and broken human bodies. Smoldering remains of destroyed Sherman tanks and shattered Higgins boats littered the treacherous shoreline, violently tossed about by the uncaring, frigid waves of the English Channel. Medical corpsmen moved like ghostly apparitions through the dense, lingering fog, their desperate, frantic efforts to save the severely wounded, offering a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the overwhelming, monumental scale of industrial slaughter that had just occurred on this desolate stretch of land. Captain Davies slowly turned away from the devastating cliff edge, his weary eyes methodically scanning the bruised, battered, and profoundly traumatized faces of the surviving infantrymen gathered silently behind him. "Check your weapons, redistribute all remaining ammunition, and tend to your wounded immediately," he ordered softly, his gravelly voice entirely devoid of its earlier, desperate ferocity. Private Miller sat slumped heavily against a shattered concrete wall, his trembling hands violently shaking as he stared blankly at a small, crumpled photograph of his family that he had somehow managed to keep dry throughout the unimaginable, horrific mourning ordeal. "Are you injured, Miller?" Davies asked with gentle, paternal concern, kneeling awkwardly beside the shivering young soldier whose face was completely masked by a thick layer of dried mud, sweat, and other men's blood. "I think I am entirely in one piece, sir. But I cannot stop my hands from shaking," Miller whispered brokenly, entirely unable to tear his haunted gaze away from the blood-soaked earth beneath his heavy combat boots. The captain placed a reassuring, steady hand on the boy's trembling shoulder, fully understanding that the deepest, most permanent wounds inflicted today would never physically bleed. Despite the overwhelming physical exhaustion threatening to completely paralyze their aching muscles, the battered company knew they could not afford to remain stationary on the vulnerable, exposed clifftop for very long. The surviving platoon sergeants began barking quiet, urgent commands, aggressively pushing their traumatized men into defensive formations to secure the newly captured high ground against inevitable enemy counterattacks. Davies walked methodically among the shallow, hastily dug fighting positions, ensuring that every exhausted soldier had clear, interlocking fields of fire pointing toward the dense, menacing hedgerows that heavily concealed the uncharted, dangerous French countryside waiting directly ahead. Looking back toward the churning ocean, Davies observed the massive, unparalleled logistical machinery of the Allied invasion forces finally beginning to pour relentlessly onto the heavily secured, blood-soaked beachhead. Enormous landing ships slowly ground their heavy iron ramps onto the sandy shore, steadily offloading fresh, unblooded infantry divisions, heavy armored vehicles, and vital artillery pieces that would desperately fuel the grueling inland campaign. Yet, the veteran captain knew with absolute, chilling certainty that these newly arriving soldiers would be forced to march directly over the violently shattered bodies of the brave men who had purchased this very ground. The thick, oppressive gray clouds that had menacingly shrouded the turbulent morning sky finally began to break apart, allowing thin, fragile rays of pale sunlight to illuminate the horrific, unprecedented devastation below. This newfound, cruel clarity only served to sharply highlight the staggering, deeply sickening price of their hard-fought victory, exposing thousands of lifeless American bodies gently bobbing in the crimson-stained surf. Davies forcefully swallowed the heavy, bitter lump forming in his dry throat, silently pledging to never forget the immense, unparalleled sacrifice made by these courageous young boys who had willingly charged directly into an absolute slaughterhouse. A weary medic approached Davies with slow, dragging footsteps, his white armband completely saturated with dark, dried blood from hours of performing frantic, desperate triage on the deeply scarred battlefield. "We have stabilized the critical cases, Captain, but we desperately need a dedicated evacuation route down to the beach," the medic reported with a hollow, emotionally drained voice. "Organize a carrying party and use the draw we just cleared," Davies instructed firmly, knowing that properly caring for the shattered survivors was his absolute highest priority now that the devastating, murderous guns of the Atlantic Wall were finally silenced. Sitting briefly on a discarded German ammunition crate, Davies allowed himself a fleeting, agonizing moment to truly process the monumental, world-altering significance of what his decimated company had miraculously achieved. They had successfully broken through Adolf Hitler's supposedly invincible, meticulously engineered coastal defenses, securing a vital, desperate foothold that would eventually allow the vast Allied armies to liberate a completely subjugated continent. However, this profound, historic triumph offered absolutely no immediate comfort to the fiercely grieving soldiers who had just watched their closest friends violently perish in the unforgiving, freezing waters and bloody sands of the Normandy coast. The distant, menacing rumble of heavy artillery echoing from the lush, green fields of the Normandy countryside served as a brutal, inescapable reminder that this horrific morning was merely the violent beginning of a very long, grueling war. The deeply entrenched enemy would inevitably regroup, violently launching fierce, determined counterattacks through the dense, claustrophobic hedgerows that characterized the treacherous, unforgiving terrain of northern France. Davies slowly picked up his heavy, mud-caked rifle, carefully checking the worn mechanical action with meticulous, practiced precision, heavily steeling his shattered nerves for the brutal, relentless combat that undoubtedly awaited them tomorrow morning. "All right, gentlemen, gather your gear and prepare to move out in 5 minutes," Davies announced, his strong, steady voice projecting a comforting, necessary illusion of total control and unwavering confidence. The exhausted, filthy soldiers slowly hauled their battered bodies upward from the cold, damp earth, shouldering their heavy canvas packs with muted, collective groans of profound physical agony and deep, unspoken grief. They were no longer the innocent, terrified boys who had nervously boarded the transport ships just hours ago. The brutal, searing crucible of Omaha Beach had forcefully forged them into hardened, uncompromising instruments of modern warfare. As the battered, diminished company began their slow, grueling march inland away from the haunting, cliffside precipice, Captain Davies cast one final, lingering look back at the chaotic, blood-drenched sands of the French coastline. The heavy, immense weight of command pressed violently against his exhausted soul, an invisible, crushing burden composed entirely of the enduring memories of those courageous men who would forever remain 20 years old. They had successfully secured the vital beachhead through unparalleled bravery, but the long, dark, and unimaginably bloody road straight to the heart of Berlin had only just terrifyingly opened before their tired feet.